Sally is judging the journalists.
What is this MUN vibes?
It feels like a job.
No, another thing I think about. I think the fairest, most socially mobile educational systems are the ones that focus primarily on academic content, have a high, strong focus on things like standardized testing, which are good, which are both difficult and good at ranking students. Note that this debate is primarily about assessment. It's not really about teaching, because presumably the content of how you teach and the modes in which how you teach are agreed upon in this debate is primarily about how you assess students. But in any case, we think that trying to shift student behavior by changing assessment is probably very blunt to all speak a bit on that as well. So what I want to talk about in my debate, I want to talk about firstly the inequality of access that's promoted by including non-academic criteria as part of grading. Secondly, I want to explain why these non-academic things are poorly assessed and what the reasons behind that are likely to change. And finally, I want to talk about how this shifts incentives both for people doing other assessment of these kids as well as the behavior themselves. How do we think, before that though, how do we think we can still achieve some of the goals of holistic education, which is presumably the aim of including these non-academic things in your academic assessment? We think you can do so by changing assessment systems to be less rigid. For example, if you think you want kids to come to class, presumably as a reasonable attendance component, then you should incentivize your course content to make it such that there is an advantage or that classes are, like maybe class discussions are particularly enriching, or you gain some insight by being in class. But it shouldn't be a disqualifying measure for students who cannot meet this, nor should it be an absolute number that's appended as part of your attendance grade. We think that's a very blunt instrument and improper way of doing so. If you want, for example, assessments to be less focused on rote learning or memorizations, curriculum can easily be made in such a fashion that is possible with things like project work and so on and so forth. We don't think that's a deep problem in this debate. The first thing is on why we think non-academic measures tend to be unequal in terms of access. And the reason for this is that poorer, less cultured students are already at a disadvantage. They have less money, for example, to pursue the sorts of academic enrichment opportunities like tuition that richer parents and so on and so forth can afford. So that's true on both sides of the house. But we think non-academic measures deepen this measure because the fact that these students are time poor and influence poor is expanded in measures which are less academic. The reason for this is the school as an institution is probably quite good at supplying students with a reasonable amount of material needed to catch up with your academic grades. The entire education system is geared towards this. Textbooks are reasonably affordable. It's comparative, of course. Sometimes textbooks are expensive. But we think having both buy textbooks as well as other non-academic stuff is probably more expensive. But also often some of these criteria, including the ones listed in the motion, are explicitly set out in a way that disadvantage people. So for example, attendance requirements in classes mean that college students who have to do degrees part-time or who have children at home find it harder to get a fair grade or a fair assessment out of those things. Things like extracurricular grading mean that if you're in extracurricular, which is considered less popular or less easy to score in, or if you have to purchase the sort of stuff that allows you to excel at extracurricular things like ballet or debating, which are much easier to access for people who are already richer and better cultured, make it harder for students to excel. When these are also a component in your assessment. It's not clear why all of these things should be bound up with your grade. A grade that claims to assess your ability in a particular subject is opposed to some kind of holistic number that's supposed to capture how good you are in general. So, on the other hand, academic assessments are generally quite good at assessing how good you are at a particular thing. If you have a math, your math grade or your reading grade is probably like a better capture of just how good you are at a specific thing because it's targeted towards your performance in it. This is exacerbated by the second problem, so thank you. Which is that structurally, I think non-academic, the education system is bad at assessing non-academic outcomes. And additionally, I would say that maybe it's actually just quite difficult to assess non-academic outcomes to the sort of degree of fairness we expect within the education system. So why is this? Firstly, many of these non-academic activities are inherently subjective. I mean, we can joke about debating course all we want, but we know that it's just quite hard to assess how good a speaker is relative to others. In the same way that it's probably quite hard to assess just how high performing a particular student is in any particular co-curricular activity, be it football or ballet, and so on and so forth. But even if you're possibly to objectively assess in these instances, there are a number of problems and obstacles here. Firstly, the level of professionalism that's accorded to these instructors is structurally less likely to be as high as the level of professionalism that's expected of educators in the academic field, simply because the Ministry of Education knows deeply its pedagogy and academic assessment, but does not know the pedagogy and academic assessment of every single curricular field out there, nor can it be expected to, which is an example of why debate coaching worldwide is so poorly accredited. I mean, just think about it. Beyond that, there's massive variance in terms of ability, much more so than within the academic field, which is to say, many of these non-academic matters are areas where genius or natural ability in a particular field are incredibly important, or where there's sort of less amount of time devoted to development in any of these fields, meaning that it's unlikely that people are able to catch up with hard work in the same way that they are in academics, with the sheer amount of time devoted to academic material within the curriculum. The upshot is, most of the extra time that comes into doing all of this is likely to come at the expense of other activities. So parents who are richer are better able to purchase opportunities for their students to do well in these instances that is not available to poorer students. That means that access is poor, above and beyond the fact that structurally it is difficult to assess whether these things are good or not. The fact that these things are also unaccountable because graders are rarely assessed again for how well they grade these students.
Given that the poor are often unable to access all sorts of things, including good grades, why isn't increasing the amount of options for them to perform well a bad thing?
Because it is not an increase. Well, firstly, if you increase the number of options they have to perform well, but this particular option is more stacked against them than other things, then you're reducing the chance to succeed. Actually, I think that's a good answer to the field. Okay. So there's little economy on the part of graders. If you look at it as an internship, for example, if an internship is graded, bosses often devote very little time to actually assessing how well the interns do and are likely to grade that intern on the basis of like how attractive they are or whether they like spoke in a nice voice or whatever, just because they are not accountable for the decisions they have to make. And there is no ability for the education system to go back and ask like industry professionals, why is it that you grade it this way? Or please grade more fairly in the future. Finally, we think in terms of signal and noise. This means that in terms of holistic assessment on the part of admissions officers or employers down the line, they have a confused signal as to the actual academic viability of the student, because these things are now bundled up in the grade. The notion, for example, that CCA credit, extracurricular credits could substitute for your performance elsewhere in one particular implementation of this policy means that you confuse assessors on whether the student is actually capable in a particular field. They can continue to carry out holistic assessment, of course, but we don't think that is double-counted. Your extracurriculars should be on a separate category, and your grades should be a different thing.
Yeah.
No judgment.
There's no judge. There's still who is going to judge us.
No, I'll just double check.
We're at next door, right?
Because then you run into the same let me first start off by saying what we think students code is like what we want to include in these non-academic pursuits. We think that you can include all the things that Jan talks about, CCAs, internships, volunteer, class fund, but it can, for example, be tailored to a specific course that you are talking about. So for example, for part-time like graduate studies that's meant, for example, for working adults, things like attendance requirements can be less important compared to other metrics simply because we think that they can be tailored to the specific context of that specific course. but we think attendance requirements are quite important if you're a full-time university student, because there's just no real reason why you, I mean, excluding like exceptional reasons, right? Or like if you are really disprivileged, you cannot make it to university, so on and so forth. The majority of people should be able to attend university. But more importantly, we are going to grade these non-academic requirements as a pass-fail or a graduation requirement. We think this is quite important because it deals with whatever PM talks about the subjectivity of grading of internships, so on and so forth. Because it's ultimately a requirement for you to just attend this particular internship program for like 3 to 6 months, or even up to a year, and then you learning, for example, those valuable skills. We're going to be talking to you about 3 very specific things. One, we're going to be talking to you about first, why these non-academic indicators are quite important to prepare students ultimately for the workplace. Secondly, why ultimately ameliorates privilege, specifically the problems that they want to talk about in clash. And lastly, ultimately about why this allows education systems as a whole to incentivize like non-selfish reasons and incentivize good behaviors for these particular students. Firstly, why do we think they prepare students for the workplace better? We think academia is important in terms of training, discipline, studying, in terms of exchange of ideas, but things like CCA and internships are often quite crucial to develop, and we would say in some ways even more important than academia, about developing specific skills that, to allow graduates to succeed. For example, education systems around the world find it incredibly hard to keep up with industry demands, especially in specialized fields like finance, because the industry changes a lot. Internship requirements, by forcing you, for example, to take an internship in an area like a bank or finance is often quite important, because you do on-the-job learning on the most relevant industry skills at that point in time. A case in point is financial modeling for any form of finance course that you want. It only really became a big thing 5 years ago in terms of like graduates learning these particular technical skills. And education institutions, because of their size and inertia, find it extremely hard to keep on. Internships, therefore, are quite important in order for students to develop this kind of relevant skills. The same can be applied for things like CCA, and we would even evaluate things like the code of conduct of particular students. Your ability to succeed at the workplace is not a function of how well you like study or how hard you study, but often because of the whole myriad of social factors that you have to develop. How well, for example, you work with your co-workers, like how are you able to operate within a team? Are you able to like make the team better? All these kind of intangibles that standardized testing simply cannot test. So CCAs and class of conducts are quite important for your like in terms of developing these skills. Here's the fundamental. So, and I don't think it is quite non-contentious. The problem under the elbow, where this is no longer a graduation requirement for students, is that the average student will simply not do these things like internships, will simply not do these things. While privileged students, understanding the importance of these particular like extracurriculars, will still devote time and attention to doing it. And insofar as companies are now increasingly valuing the unique skills that you bring to their table, you being able to tell them that I've done a relevant internship at the field, like as recently as last year, gives you a massive increase no matter the type of grades that you actually create. The type of society that they create and why it's more disprivileged ultimately only means privileged students do these extracurriculars, boost up their speeds and still get hired before I'm on.
Will you assess these internships?
Yes, as a pass-fail or like a graduation requirement. So for example, as long as you finish that 12 weeks of a particular internship or however long that period, you will be able to graduate, but you will not be able to graduate if you haven't succeeded at internship. You won't get like an A, B, C, D within that particular internship, for example. Second, why don't we think this ameliorate this privilege? I think Reuben was quite, in answering Reuben's POI, Jan was quite smart in terms of saying that, in some ways internships compound this privilege much more than academics. This is not true. Mr. Speaker, let's just be clear. When you are studying, academics is by in no metric and egalitarian way to measure. Like in Singapore, like parents give their kids like 20+ hours of tuition every single week, and the ability for richer parents to pay for better tutors ultimately means that at the end of the day, they are able, for example, they are better to game that particular system. The problem with internship requirements, for example, or CCAs and so on and so forth, and why they're ultimately far more egalitarian, is that insofar as we recognize the importance of this, by making it a component for graduation for most particular graduates, education institutions themselves have an incentive to try and ameliorate these kinds of discrimination. So for example, under their role, where we agree internships are important, average students who have with poor parents, have no way to access influential internships. But under our world, for example, where education institutions make it a requirement for you to graduate with these internships, they enact policies to ensure that every student in their particular university can access good and fruitful internships. For example, what SMU has is the setting up of a career center, which allows poorer students to tap into the network and brand of that particular school to source for internships through that particular career center itself. The counterfactor on their side is that even when recognized internships as important, rich students can just ask their parents for influential internships. And like poorer students don't have that option. Sure, we agree that this problem might still occur on our side, but it occurs to a far less degree than it actually happens on theirs. It massively compounds the privilege that they talk about, and we don't think that ultimately is a good thing. We think that lastly and quite importantly, is that the point of an education system often is not just a holistic access of like the type of student that you are, but the imposition of requirements such as in Singapore, you have to do CIP, basically you have to do some kind of community work, for example, for your community is quite important in terms of incentivizing the moral character development of your particular student. For example, by forcing you to do community work for like 4 months to 6 months period, it's quite important in terms of getting privileged university students to keep in touch with disprivileged aspects of that particular community and foster that sense of community awareness. I think that education should simply be about your ability to develop yourself for the workforce, but in exchange, for example, for the ability to enter an institute of higher education, the state or any kind of society is quite important, is quite within its rights to impose these particular requirements in terms for you. The entire pitch for opposition is quite simple, right? We think that these kind of non-academic curriculars can be tailored to the specific institution that you are talking about. But insofar as we all agree that in order to be a holistically developed human being, you need far more things to do than just to study. We think that these requirements are a good thing. We're very proud of those.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister.
A couple of things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the importance of non-academic extracurricular stuff and why it's particularly relevant in this debate and why students should opt in, or like what the prerogative behind opting in particular non-academic extracurricular stuff should be. Secondly, I'm going to expound much more on the access aspect of this debate and why that is important. And lastly, I'm going to talk about this work industry and response from college admissions and so on and so forth that should be going to talk about. But before that, I would just like to point out that I don't think setting up extracurricular stuff as a graduation requirement is necessarily in the spirit of the motion, given that the motion states that it should be a measure of performance, wherein just assuming that whether you go and attend that particular thing is not exactly a measure of performance in terms of final grading, so just as a graduation requirement, but I'm still going to deal with it given that it came from their side. So let's talk about the first thing that they said. They said that it's important for students to prepare and train for the kind of work that they might get into, the industry they might get into, and so on and so forth. Yes, it's very important, and the importance of these things is what makes people realize automatically that these things are important. So nobody needed to tell me throughout 4 years of college that I needed to intern at various places to get into finance, because I already knew the importance of doing those internships and working in that particular thing. But it should not be essential to my success at any other point of my life. That the fact that I do an internship or not do an internship should not be the determining cause of whether I succeed later in life or not. It is my choice at the point of time where I want to intern to get a job in finance or so on and so forth, wherein it is not a mandatory requirement. None of those internships are a mandatory requirement for me. But the fact that I did that means that the importance of doing those things is already predicated inside of me, irrespective of the background that I come from, given that job requirements are often very stringent in this hyper-competitive world. The second thing they tell is that, but we give people more options to succeed. Ms. Speaker, recognize that giving more venues where people from poor backgrounds and non-cultured backgrounds can be disadvantaged is not good. Because often schools develop their infrastructure academically first. That most schools are often well equipped to deliver academic performance or academic coaching to students within those particular schools. The other infrastructure such as extracurricular stuff often comes at the secondary level to these schools. So people often in low SES backgrounds, etc., often do worse in national examinations when you have this disparity in what the school as an infrastructure can provide or not. So at the point of time where academic stuff is the first thing that the governments develop and schools develop, we think the academic stuff and ability to assess on that academic stuff where people can then focus on that and do not have to care about the other things is a much better outcome that you can hope for. So natural base starting point when you just consider academic stuff as the final grading point of that particular individual means that it's quite the same, or at least even in a worst case, at least better than the infrastructure that the extracurricular stuff can provide on their end. So let's talk about the importance of non-academic extracurricular stuff, right? Because often we say, and I agree, that non-academic extracurricular stuff is important. Should be told you about a lot of things, that you need to have a well-rounded personality in this world, you need to add to the education experience, you need to develop passions, interests, hobbies, and find a thing that students like and are genuinely interested in. What making it great and changes is the decision-making calculus of why you opt into a particular thing. And this is very important, right? Because choosing to do a particular activity by a student under their side becomes a result of a very different calculus. Given that it's graded, the decision to take up an activity then becomes a result of how easy it is to score a good grade rather than a genuine interest in learning or having an interest in that particular activity, which means that it goes against the very objective of extracurricular stuff, developing a well-rounded personality, because at the point of time where you're focusing on gaming the system so you can get the best grade out of it rather than developing an actual genuine interest in that particular thing to make sure that you have a better personality as you wanted these kids to have, means that you often give up on the very objective of this extracurricular stuff. The harmful manifestation of that is simply the concept that we have all as Asian kids have gone through in our lives. That is tiger parenting. At the point of time where parents have a vested interest in what grades their kids get, a vested interest in how much and how well their kids do in school because grades is what matters. At that point, a genuine exploration of the activities available to these kids becomes less of a deal to these parents and less of a deal to these households. Piano lessons, cello lessons, ballet, etc., forced down our throats as the idea of finding something interesting to do is completely lost. Yes?
Don't all of these harms exist to a greater degree when it comes to academia?
Why though? Because I think at the point of time where essential stuff is taught to you and infrastructure is built in those schools at the first place, where academic provision is the primary focus of those schools, I think it's far less disadvantageous and disparate amongst rich cultured kids versus poor kids. Because the focus of these schools in the first place, provided provision by the government, is to have course content and academic provisioning to these kids. The third manifestation of this is the literal enjoyment of these activities, which should be a primary focus by these students, is literally lost when they do it in the form of grades, when they do it in a hyper-competitive exercise or environment under their side. And the last thing I want to talk about within this importance of extracurricular stuff is it's recognize that under the realm of possibilities, the resources that schools have, not all activities can be provided to an equal level. So basically, the burden those students choose within the activity that's provided to them and basically succeed or excel in them to have a grade that basically determines the rest of their life. So at that point, it's an unfair advantage to people that often have a predisposition or natural advantage at certain of these activities versus others who possibly don't. I recognize that this is also the case for, say, math, English, and so on and so forth, but at the point of time where the natural learning level, or the base learning level of these things in terms of academics, where the provisioning of these resources at the very base of these academics is much better from the school side, we think from the supply side it makes much more sense to focus on these academic things in terms of final grade. Let's talk about access then, right? I told you a few things and Jan told you a few things as well, right? The lower tier schools, etc., often like to worse in national examinations and infrastructure because provision creates a large disparity. But on the side of the student, a natural ability or just basically richer parents who are having more culture, having more exposure to these things means that you're often left out of that particular thing. This means that at the end of the day, when the response from college admissions to work is what we care about, it means that unfair hiring practice is not unfair in terms of unethical, but unfair in terms of just the kind of provision that they have for different people results. Why is that? Because you're not able to access an actual ability of these people. That, of course, this assessment can still be holistic, Mr. Speaker, but we on our side provide a much more purer information to the hiring committee or to the admissions committee of these universities. Why is that important? Because this means that to opt into a math major at math uni. It doesn't care whether you were good at dramatics in school. It doesn't care whether you attended those math classes, but it does care about natural inclination towards that subject and whether you have a genuine passionate interest in that subject, which can be now effectively displayed by the kind of grades that you get in that particular subject throughout your high school. This means that often when you go into the work culture, like hiring committees can now effectively differentiate between how good of a collaborator you are versus whether you are good at the technical aspect of doing the job well. Yeah. We think it's far important that this information can now be disparate and different rather than bundled into one big package together. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much.
I think it's interesting that Virat comes up here and tells us that essentially the reason why he has his job is because he engaged in a number of internships. That he had the foresight to go and find himself proactively, not understanding that he's an anomaly to an education system. Most people in an education system comply by the education system instead of act in active defiance of it because they have extra knowledge of what exists elsewhere that is often given to them by privilege, not perhaps in Virat's case, but in the majority of cases where people act in defiance of the majority education system, right? I think that also reinforces the idea of what Reuben was saying in the initial part of his speeches, right? The idea that these internships are actually incredibly important, almost disproportionately important in actually finding you relevant work experience. Number two, being able to get you the kind of social skills that are deeply necessary in order for you to actually function well. And importantly, these things are recognized by the companies that are going to hire you, regardless of the industry that you are in, as being important and like just as important as school, for example, right? Then the question becomes one of privilege, right? Because they said that, oh, the problem is if you have like a requirement that makes these things into like as important as an academic requirement, then privilege gets in the way because it is easier to perform well in school basically for a less privileged kid rather than to like engage in a plethora of activities that require you to distribute your time and resources, right? I think that this is number one, their characterization of privilege so far has been problematic because this debate has focused on the most disprivileged of students. So the idea is that what if you're at the worst schools, for example, and like you have the poorest infrastructure, for example, and you are the poorest kind of kids, for example, then it makes sense that you want to focus on like just exclusively studies. But I think that it's also important to realize that this debate cannot just be about the most disprivileged. It's about the average kids or the middle class kids or the lower middle class kids, for example, and what they have access to vis-a-vis like upper middle class kids, because that forms the bulk of most like societies, right? So then the question becomes, how do lower middle class kids compete with upper middle class kids, right? And I think that here it's a lot easier to establish that like having like extra academic activities is less like rigged towards privilege. In fact, it actually helps to ameliorate privilege, and I'll be talking about that later on, right? So I think that number one, this idea of like, infrastructure that they were talking about, so they actually banked on it quite a lot. Their idea was basically that, oh, if you have like, the reason why like poorer kids aren't able to access is because like over the years, like MOE or like whoever has been more interested in like creating infrastructure for academic purposes, and that means that all of these schools already have infrastructure for academic purposes, and it's much harder to get like infrastructure for non-academic purposes or like the necessary skills or assessment for non-academic purposes. I don't think that this is necessarily true. I think that always education systems are playing catch up. So if you're talking about critical skills or creative thinking skills, for example, those are new things that have been introduced to the education system. The education system handles imperfectly as well. But those are implemented in like schools across the board as well because they are recognized as being deeply important. Of course, initially they are handled at imperfect level, and they are handled more imperfectly by lower middle class schools or public schools. But that is the case with academic like performance as well, and those like infrastructure as well, right? You have poorly trained teachers who go to like those schools, for example. You will have like less training and less familiarity with what you're meant to teach, for example. That is natural, but that is what you need to do in order to make sure that your education system is able to facilitate, like to create better students on the whole, like overall, right? I'll sit up. So I want to talk then a little bit about like this idea of you cannot objectively assess these things, or these things cannot like be or the idea that these things are inherently subjective. I think that number one, obviously, and this came out in Young's speech, right? This idea that like, oh, it's subjective because the people who are trained to do it are less are, number one, less well trained, and number two, like less well policed by the Ministry of Education. I think this is largely a result of like them not being actual requirements for like students. So all of us understand that like, debating, for example, is just not that important like at the end of the day because it's not actually taken as part of your final grade. Meaning that obviously the trainers for it like can be chosen in a much more lax manner, right? Which is why right now like debate trainers literally just don't have to be criminals and then you can get your MMA certificate already, right? So that obviously means that like there'll be better training that goes into these things and a better like infrastructure that involves from these things. Things that JP was talking about, like a career center, for example, or like internship centers, for example, that help you like access these things, like even if you're a lower middle class student, right? Then let's talk about this idea of privilege, right? They wanted to give us this idea of privilege that had to do with the most like disprivileged students. I think that we need to focus on the bulk of the lower middle class, right? For these students, your most privileged kids are going to be able to access all of these skills and experiences because their parents think that it's important and because they're in social situations where like these things are recognized as important. So not only internships, but also like CCA or growing up with those things, or like growing up with a plethora of experiences, right? This number one creates more tangible skills from you right from the get-go. The problem is when you are a more like disprivileged kid, like lower middle class or whatever, 3-room HDB, that kind of thing, the fact of the matter is that you don't have access to those things or those experiences, but instead you are told by the education system and you're signaled by the education system that what's most important is your ability to mug unconditionally, right? You then try and succeed by mugging unconditionally, arrive at the same place that these students are at, only to realize that you're hopelessly like disadvantaged compared to them because they have all these like wide range of experiences and skills that you were never even introduced to or not even thought the importance of, right? So I think here, even if you're able to access an imperfect version of those things, like you get a less spectacular internship, for example, that still helps you much better than having an education system that signals to you that the only thing is important is like a single-minded like racetrack attitude towards like academic performance. Because at the end of the day, that disprivileges you in both tangible and intangible terms, right? Tangibly, of course, because of the things that we have all recognized in this debate, strangely enough, are important, like the relevant job skills, experiences that CCA provides, social skills, etc. But intangibly, because all of these more privileged kids, like who end up in the same university as you, or like in the better universities than you, end up thinking of themselves as more sophisticated, as more cultured, but also importantly as being more inherently capable than you are, because they have a much wider understanding of the world and a much stronger sense of self as a result of having engaged in all of these things. You do not think of yourself this way. The problem is that most kids end up internalizing this, which is why they never end up doing better than the more privileged kids, because they internalize the idea that they are less capable, for example. And the only way they know how to break out of that is by mugging even harder, at that point where mugging will only allow you to fail, right? So at the end of the day, what the education system has taught you to do also teaches you to be constantly subordinate to the most privileged of people. We think that this is actually a bad education system, right? An education system that entrenches privilege across the board, across the majority of people. And we cannot say that just because it is imperfectly administered at the lowest rungs of privilege, then it is a bad education system or a bad move for the education system to take when it ends up empowering the majority of people and eventually the most disprivileged as well. We are very proud to do it.
central idea and the central push on that side on like preparing students for the workplace, and there are this list of things that you need to do to prepare students for the workplace. I'm going to tell you why that's not necessary. Secondly, I'm going to reiterate the point about access, which I don't think those guys responded to sufficiently. I'm going to thirdly talk about why micromanaging what skills and what like qualities people should have in joining the workplace from the point of like the student, from the point of the colleges is bad. And finally, I'm going to look at the actual benefit of extracurriculars that are lost on that side. Before that, I also have a story of like my internship, right? I was told by interview that I have a requirement to to go to an internship, and that was the end of what I heard from NTU. That I need to do an internship. When I did an internship, I went there, did nothing all day. I used to get the free snacks, and 6 months later, I came back none the wiser, right? In an alternate world, Mr. Speaker, where NTU would realize that instead of just forcing students to take an internship, I can convince them to take an internship if that's actually important. I might have taken those lessons from NTU. I might have actually done something in that internship that would have proven useful to me. So I just don't think that, yeah, like it's a problem of like just people knowing these things. So first of all, these ideas of preparing students for the workplace, right? And the biggest chunks of examples are surrounding internships on that side, right? So the first thing that they say is internships are important and you need to incentivize students to do that. I question that premise. I don't know if it is true that there are insufficient avenues to incentivize students and making this compulsory is the only option, right? So I think they give too little credit to people who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, because even then you spend 4 years in university and like probably after the 2-year mark you start thinking seriously about your career opportunities, right? In that 2-year period you have access to all of the things that colleges can do, such as to convince you that internships are important, such as introductory lessons to like these are the skills that are required for the workplace, or for example just talking to your colleagues and talking to your seniors and just the general sense that is prevalent in society that you need to gain actual experience in order to do these things, right? So I don't think that 2 years of experience and actual interaction is insufficient, right? Even if that was the case, the career fairs and stuff that they talk about on that side can perfectly exist very well on our side, where the university recognizes that we won't make this compulsory because we believe that some students might not be able to do it, but we still believe that this is important, and we will give students exposure and the ability to actually sign on to internships if they want to do that, right? So what are the problems if you actually do make it compulsory, right? The first is, Mr. Speaker, if students just aren't able to find internships, right? Because they did concede that a lot of people can use their contacts because they come from rich backgrounds, etc., and they can actually get into good places for internships. A lot of poor students, despite the number of options that some universities might be able to provide, just aren't able to get into those places, right? Especially in a hiring scenario where people are incredibly biased against certain groups of people, which might again be a factor that might play against them. The second problem, Mr. Speaker, is that a lot of students might, for other reasons, maybe they work part-time and they actually want to get paid for that work because they're supporting a family, cannot do that internship, cannot commit to that 6-month period. I think that in those cases, that decision must be left for those students. I think ultimately, if you trust students to care about their grades, you ought also trust students to make the better balancing act about their long-term career prospects and what's most important for them in the short term, right? So I think, and the third thing, I think that the schools lose out on actually doing the work to convince students to actually do these internships if they're so important. They just tick the box that these are necessarily part of your grade, and most students just see it in that way rather than thinking that this is actually a means to an end. Sit down. Okay. The next example that they gave is just the second example. Is of community service, that we want to inculcate moral values in students, right? I'm just not sure that is the case, Mr. Speaker, because they are passing a value judgment. They're saying that a lot of time spent in community service, inculcating moral values is more important than students just spending that time being at their books and becoming better at what they do, and ultimately that altruistic thing is going to be more important than they just becoming better in the technical sense of what they are doing, right? I don't think they actually support that claim on that side. So I think colleges should equip students to do all of these things, but they should ultimately leave that student decision to student. Secondly, moving on to the point about access, right? This has been a claim on that side, that basically we are now providing students, the poor students, more options to excel, right? But the problem is that the grading is relative, right? So you're providing them more options, but you're also providing all of the rich students more options, right? And they have a better ability to access those options for all of the reasons that aren't provided to you, right? Because they have more access to tuition classes. People who go to better schools have more access to the infrastructure that supports things like music and dancing and so on and so forth, right? Notice that they actually didn't want to defend these examples, but in a world in which we restrict the criteria to be academic and they allow non-academic criteria, many schools would say that, singing or extracurriculars and sports and so on and so forth are part of your criteria that you need to fulfill for grades. So we don't want that world, but they did actually want to defend the implications of their policy. Before I move on, yes?
What would be the incentive for school? So the problem of privilege of access to internship access occurs on both sides of the house. What would be the incentive for schools to try try and ameliorate that privilege on your side when this is not a graduation requirement or any form of grading?
Yeah, because they still want the long-term prospects of the students to go out. Because rankings of colleges are based on how well the students, when they leave the college and graduate from the college, do, not based on how many students like fulfill an extra grade requirement or not, right? That's completely nonsense. The third point that I want to move on, Mr. Speaker, and something that they didn't respond to, is that micromanaging of what requirements are important for what industry is bad. Maybe it is the case that some industries require an internship experience. Some industries don't, Mr. Speaker, because they believe that they can just get the person who's most technically suited for the job and train them on the job, right? That's exactly the point that Virat made to you. That industries can, under our scenario, separate the academic potential and the academic qualities of the student versus their work experience. And they can make a better judgment on how much they want to balance the social work, and how much they want to balance the social skills and the experience on that side. And Jan's points about the assessors actually not being very reliable is important here, because all of these like assessments of attendance or how good your social skills are, etc., are actually not very accurate. So it's better to leave that to the people who are hiring, because ultimately, if that's not the case, it's going to lead to worse hiring decisions, which is unfair to the people who are left out and who lose out because of this. The final thing that Virat told you they didn't respond to is the actual effect on the extracurriculars. When extracurriculars become focused on just securing a better grade, we think people lose out on that enjoyment. It just becomes a race to just get the highest grade without people actually doing the thing that actually inspires them and they are actually passionate about, right? For all of those reasons, Mr. Speaker, because they lose the sense of what a good education ought to be, very proud of.
Oh, your definition thing. 2 seconds.
I'm going to start off which model better corrects for privilege and inequality, because that seems to be a large part of Saigoman's case. So Saigoman argued that certain individuals are time poor and influence poor, and as such can't access internships and the like. I asked in the QI very early on that given that all methods of evaluation have problems with privilege, won't providing as many avenues as possible work well for giving more shots in the gun for the underprivileged? Jan's answer was quite glib, and it was something that was carried down throughout the bench, right? That academia works better without actually explaining why. It is insufficient to claim that all other avenues are bad without providing the comparative to academic evaluation. We argue that it is by far the worst option. Why? Because it is easiest to gain. For example, we told you very early on that we have tuition classes, extra classes, prep schools in Korea, Singapore, and Japan, right? Differences in access to preschool education can have a massive lifelong impact over your educational career, just those 2 or 3 years within preschool education. Or the learning environment at home, or whether your family, and some of you might have experience with this, speaks English as a first language, can have a huge impact on whether you are able to succeed in an English medium school, right? If your family is poor and uneducated, that's going to have a huge impact on your own ability to succeed in academia. Whether you have the money to pay for entrance exam prep schools to access higher education. Virat's only response is that in a world where we focus on academia, somehow all schools will be able to raise the level of education and then all students can benefit because we just focus on one thing. So all schools suddenly magically do it better. There are 3 responses to this. First, there's a flawed assumption that all schools will achieve the exact same level in terms of academic education. But there will always be massive differences between private and public schools. elite and non-elite institutions. There will be differences in terms of funding, in access to a private network of donors, in access to quality teachers. So all of these differences still are amplified, especially when it comes to education, or when it comes to academia. Even if all schools focus on academia, there will still be an uneven playing field. And this is where my second response comes in, right? That in fact, why certain schools choose to focus less on academic quality and focus on all sorts of other core curricular activities or like other more holistic forms of education that they gain like real life working experience, that they have tie-up with industries, or they have things like vocational training and the like. Or they focus on sports or arts programs, because some schools can't compete otherwise. So what they do is they remove certain schools' abilities to provide a comparative advantage for themselves as educational institutions, as well as for their own students who can't get access to the top, like best, like schools like Yale and Cornell, or even like NTU, right? But the third response is this, that the private sector will always do it better. They will always be able to provide higher levels of academic training and the like, right? We mentioned this down the bench. However, poor students, on the other hand, because they exist in a world where you've been fucked by the birth lottery, it is far better that you have more lottery tickets or more ways to win the lottery. What does this mean? Because if you aren't able to be a top student in terms of academia, you still can be perhaps a good debater. You still can perhaps be a good athlete. You can perhaps be a good artist. There are many other talents that you are more likely be able to access just by virtue of you having like natural dispositions towards this thing. This means no thank you, right? Or you can have, for example, accumulated real life working experience, right? That will be useful in applications to institutions of higher education or the workforce. Yeah. That's why many institutions around the world have discretionary admission schemes, even though those things may not be hard calculated in terms of grades, but they look at you holistically. And what this essentially does is you remove the ability for these individuals to gain access to institutions of higher learning through other forms compared to academia. So on their side, they make it far less likely that poor and disenfranchised individuals are able to access things in higher education as a whole. As a whole, yes.
Do you think it's not burden this debate to claim that vocational institutions shouldn't exist?
Yeah, but you're oversimplifying my argument, right? It isn't just about vocational institutions. It's about things like, for example, schools that focus on sports programs and use that as a comparative advantage. If you listen to my speech, right? Their only response is, well, you have no time for internships. You have no time to do all these things. Or like CCAs. But that's a fucking stupid response because it works both ways. If you have no time to invest in debates or the like, why would you have as much time as everyone else to invest in studying? If you're a parent and you're studying college part-time, you will always do worse than everyone else. But if you have natural abilities in different areas, that allows you access and allows you ability to access other opportunities later on. If rich people can do everything, then it is a wash on both sides. But it is only a problem, notice, for the absolute top, where you have people that are all-rounded that can do every single thing in the world. It's a problem in terms of like scholarship applications and the like. If we're talking about your average student, right, if you can stand out in one or two ways, that is enough for you to be given a shot in life and given a shot at access to higher education. So that is where we think we win out. But ultimately, what is the value of all these other things, right? They had a few responses. That firstly, we are bad at evaluating non-academic outcomes, right? That's weird. If you win championships, or if you do well in particular activities, if you don't have to win the world championship, right? Even if I win Smu Hammers, like ultimately at the end of the day, like that's something that's useful, or even if I break or go far. But more importantly, it's about the skills you gain from participation in all these sort of extracurricular activities and the like. More importantly, it's weird that there are mechanistic quibbles about how it's difficult to evaluate the curriculum and the professionalism of such coaches and the like, because at the end of the day, or evaluating the quality of internships, because those things can be changed, and it's not a problem that's inherent within the system of evaluation. More importantly, we argue that their system privileges a certain type of personality, privileges a certain type of person that is inclined to be able to study all day. All of us do not operate the same way. All of us are not necessarily academically inclined. We argue that we should allow to evaluate people holistically and allow for access to a diversity of opinions in terms of how people should be valued in our society. We are very proud to oppose.
Yeah.
Bro, Kawhi crushing, bro.
Really?
What's the score? 9-point lead, man.
Fuck's sake, right?
Nice.
It's a dating type, bro.
The series is 3-2, right?
Yeah.
Harry.
Guys, come back later.
Sorry, bro.
Yeah. Sorry.
Internships, CIT requirements, and CCA is important, right? I think, frankly, very quickly in this debate, both sides established that they are. This debate then became about how do we allow for students to better engage with these things meaningfully and without like perpetuating privilege whilst engaging with those things, right? That was essentially the whole debate. They claim that you do it better when you have it as an optional requirement because like kids who are less privileged also have the like foresight to understand that these things are somewhat important and that we should be able to do these things whilst you do not like make these things into a mere attendance requirement. And at the same time, like because kids don't have to do this from a young age, they can just focus on studying. This is actually quite a disingenuous case, right? And the reason why is because they seem to want to take all the benefits of our side without taking any of the harms of theirs, right? In theirs, like the fact of the matter is that they continue existing in a world which doesn't prioritize like non-grade requirements, meaning that and they will also consider this early in their debate because they tried to use this as a convenient point. The idea that they have less infrastructure for these things, like these non-academic requirements, meaning that they can't claim in Sharique's speech later on that we will also have career centers, we will have internship requirement, we will have CCA requirement, and we'll be able to do all these things for you, and we'll have it voluntarily for you to do on your free time, that you can have access if you have the foresight to do those things. Why would any school do that if MOE doesn't require you to mandate those things and doesn't tell you and signal to you explicitly that these are important things for your school to focus on? We don't know, right? We tell you that obviously we have the better infrastructure, we have the better training and all of these things for these things better implemented and more implemented in a more egalitarian way as well, right? Because we told you that people who are lower down the privilege ladder will also be able to access these things that otherwise disproportionately will remain the purview of people who are well privileged or highly privileged, right? Because they exist in networks which already prioritize imbibing those things. Then they told us, then again super conveniently they told us that the reason we have vocational centers and things like that in our side as well, you're able to see your skills established and grown in our side as well, even if they are non-academic in nature. We tell you that this is exactly what Reuben and I were telling you about, right? Like when you are in secondary school, for example, and you are told by the education system that the only thing that's important is mugging. You think you're going to spend all your free time playing basketball? No, right? Because you have been told that this will fuck you up and will send all your parents' money down the drain. We tell you that when it is actually a grading requirement, that these people are actually more likely to prioritize it, and schools are more likely to prioritize it as well, meaning that you actually get the experience to engage in it, so that if you're good at it, you can actually later on go and pursue that as a potential career goal, for example. But we've also told you that the people who don't end up pursuing these things as entire career goals also benefit in the long run, because when you go to workplaces, for example, like knowledge economies or whatever, it's more important that you are able to think of yourself as a fully developed self, for example, with all of these highly relevant skills. Remember, both sides consider that these are actually really important to the workplace, right? Where you can actually compete with the person who has gone through who is from a more privileged environment, who would disproportionately have the foresight to engage with these things. I think then this debate becomes really about whether or not the less privileged person, without it becoming a great requirement, will have the foresight to engage with these things or not, right? And I think the fact of the matter is that they won't, because they were using they basically said that I have done it or I have not done it, and therefore most people won't do it, right? Without realizing that if it is not signaled to you as important within an education system, or without ever engaging with our simple logic, that if it is not signaled to you as important within the education system, you are likely to deprioritize it for the things that are signaled to you as important within the education system, meaning that even though they concede that it is deeply important, the people who need it the most, or less privileged and unable to access it, are going to be continually deprioritizing it and suffering for it, right? We think that this is incredibly problematic, because then they perpetuate the very privilege that they made the bulk of their lives. We're very proud of them.
Yeah.
Usually I hate it when debaters use debating as an example of debates, but I feel like it's quite a useful one today because it's probably the co-curricular activity that everyone in this room understands the best. So we're not speaking from a position of imaginary ignorance. Now, just think about it. Even if you think that debating has massively improved you as a person, academically or otherwise, would you have made it compulsory and would you have made it an accessible component in any part of your education? The answer is probably not. And that speaks to the heart of all of this. In this room, none of us had debating as something that we knew would kind of concretely benefit us in the academic sense. All of us are here on a freaking Sunday because we think it's fun. That is the calculus, I think, that is the case in the vast majority of these instances. Two things in my report. First thing, I want to talk about access. And the second, I want to talk about whether it's important to make things compulsory, whether it is good enough for that to be the case. And the thing about access is, the opposition team in this debate misunderstands the commutative property of access. Everyone in this debate accepts that academia is unequal, that it can be gained for rich people, and so on and so forth. So there's a massive advantage of rich people in this direction, yes? But if you add things that are unequal in the same direction and are more unequal in academia to that, that does not make the thing more equal because these inequalities don't cancel each other out, they just compound. Yes? So if we can demonstrate that extracurriculars are less equal than academia, then you shouldn't add them to make the education system more accessible and more equal. Why was this true? Firstly, relatively speaking to extracurriculars, there are more resources devoted to academia than extracurriculars. I think this is extremely true, right? Just think about the MOE. The entire infrastructure of the Ministry of Education, as I said in my speech, is devoted to the study of curricula, which is why it's false equivalence for them to say, well, but we do curriculum development all the time. Yeah, exactly. That was the business of the MOE from the beginning. It's good at doing that and devotes tons of resources to doing that. Now, compared to the amount of resources that the MOE now has to spend on extracurriculars or internships or what have you, that's minimal in terms of each individual extracurricular because there are so many of them. But just so, even if you somehow think that you could have some kind of 50-50 split in the majority of schools, you have less devoted to each individual extracurricular, which means in terms of the amount of resources that the schools are spending in terms of equalizing privilege, it's less. So, relative to academia, these things are more unequal. But are they unequal on face? Well, in a large part, they kind of just accept our arguments. They accept that there's higher cost of participation and that the opportunity cost of participation in these things hits poor kids particularly hard. Because not only do they have to spend all the time already studying, given that they have less time, free time than richer kids, they now have an additional component, whereas rich kids can spend some of that extra free time they have addressing both of these things. We told you that ultimately this doesn't ameliorate all access advantages completely. But the conclusion is that now the grade is more unfair than before. That is in effect a discount for rich kids' grades because they are likely to benefit massively in terms of these extracurriculars. And there's now no longer any double counting of admissions at admissions and employment level. That if you want to capture these other things that people are doing, you do so in a thing that is not a score that is represented. Second question is, do we need to make these things compulsory? Firstly, they said we'll get magically more resources. Just think about it, right? Like, we had a resource problem with extracurriculars and internships. Then we made it compulsory. Suddenly more resources developed to go through it. The amount of resources is relative to the amount of importance you think it is, not whether you make it a grade requirement or not. Firstly, we think it was unclear if this is true for the vast majority of things we're talking about in this debate. There's supposed to be one example of university internships that they wanted to focus on. But even in terms of university internships, you have to weigh it against student choice. You have to weigh it against whether, as Sharique said, there's sufficient incentives for students to already access each and every one of these things. And you have to recognize that as long as you made it compulsory, you are still excluding many students. Like the students who couldn't afford to take 3 months off during summer because they had to pay to work to feed themselves or pay a student debt or to feed their families. The point here was you should leave it up to the students because the marginal benefit you got from attending these things wasn't enough to ameliorate student choice, notwithstanding all the other areas of the debate that they were unwilling to defend.
Thank you.
goes first.